Have you ever noticed how the same patterns of suffering seem to follow you, like shadows that grow longer as the day draws to a close? How relationships break in familiar ways, disappointments arrive with haunting familiarity, and emotional wounds reopen along the same scars. What if this repetition is not random chance, but something you're unconsciously orchestrating? There's a peculiar comfort in familiar pain, a strange homecoming in the very suffering we claim to want liberation from. The mind, in its mysterious wisdom, returns to what it knows. We stand bewildered before the mirror of our lives, seeing reflections of the same story playing out with different characters, different settings, yet identical emotional conclusions. The boss who triggers your inadequacy, the partner who abandons, the friend who betrays. This is not coincidence. This is not bad luck. This is what Freud called the repetition compulsion, an unconscious drive to recreate and relive our most formative wounds, a psychological loop few escape. We chase healing while simultaneously running back toward our original injuries. We seek love while setting traps that ensure its failure. We desire peace while unconsciously manufacturing chaos. The most painful truth is not that suffering visits us, but that we have become its unwitting architects. We write the script, cast the characters, and direct the play, all while believing ourselves to be merely the audience. Your attractions are not random. Your triggers are not accidents. Your emotional patterns are not coincidences. They are breadcrumbs leading back to the original forest where you first became lost. Sigmund Freud observed this phenomenon over a century ago, noting how humans compulsively repeat traumatic experiences as if driven by some invisible force. Not for pleasure, but in a paradoxical attempt to master what once mastered them. We repeat what we do not remember, Freud wrote. The wounds too painful to face consciously become the very templates for our unconscious choices. The child abandoned creates an adult who chooses the unavailable. Carl Jung expanded this understanding, suggesting that what we resist meeting in ourselves becomes our fate. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it destiny. These great minds recognized a profound truth. Our suffering contains a code, a message written in the language of repetition. Break the code, and you might just break the cycle. Consider the child who grows up with inconsistent love, affection that arrives and disappears without warning. They learn that love is unreliable, that attachment brings pain, that vulnerability leads to abandonment. This child becomes an adult who unconsciously selects partners who cannot commit, who feels strangely uncomfortable when love flows freely, who sabotages stability just as it begins to take root. The conscious mind says, "I want lasting love." The unconscious mind whispers, "But familiarity is safer than healing." We confuse recognition with resonance. What feels like chemistry is often merely recognition of an old wound dressed in new clothing. The emotional signature feels right because it feels known. Think of the person who repeatedly enters relationships with controlling partners. Consciously, they resent the control. Unconsciously, it replicates the domineering parent they could never please. Or consider the achiever who never feels successful enough, constantly striving but finding no satisfaction. Their conscious desire is recognition, but their unconscious recreates the conditional approval of childhood. The water we swim in becomes invisible to us. We cannot see our patterns because we are inside them, because they formed before we had words, because they disguised themselves as identity rather than injury. But these cycles, stubborn as they seem, can be broken. The loop is not your destiny. It is merely your history attempting to preserve itself. What was once unconscious can be made conscious. The first doorway to freedom is simple awareness, the capacity to witness yourself in the act of repetition, to observe, without judgment, how you participate in recreating your familiar pain. Notice how your body feels when old patterns emerge. The tightness in your chest before saying yes to what you should refuse. The flutter of attraction to someone who cannot meet you. The anxiety that precedes self-sabotage. These sensations are messengers, speaking in a language older than words. Your body remembers what your mind forgot. It carries the emotional imprints of every significant experience you've ever had. When you feel inexplicably drawn to situations that logically make no sense, pause. Ask yourself, what does this remind me of? When have I felt this before? The second doorway is compassionate understanding. Your patterns were not created from weakness or some inherent flaw. They were adaptive responses to environments where you had limited power. The child who learned to disappear in the face of conflict did so to survive emotional overwhelm. The teenager who became perfectionist did so to earn the love that should have been freely given. These adaptations were acts of psychological genius, the mind's attempt to create safety in unsafe conditions. They served you then. They burden you now. Romanian-French philosopher Émile Cioran wrote, "We are born with the dead weight of all our past lives. Our patterns carry this weight, the accumulated strategies of surviving what should never have been survived." Understanding this shifts something profound. The question transforms from what's wrong with me to what happened to me, from self-blame to self-compassion, from shame to clarity. The third doorway is conscious choice, the deliberate decision to act differently when the familiar pattern presents itself, to stay when you would flee, to speak when you would silence, to receive when you would reject. This is not easy work. The gravitational pull of old patterns feels like destiny itself. The unfamiliar, even when healthier, registers as wrong, dangerous, uncomfortable. Growth occurs at the edge of tolerance. Mexican poet Octavio Paz understood this tension. To break out of the circle and not to turn about interminably within it is to make the final discovery. The center is empty. The patterns you've been circling have no solid center, no fixed reality that must be respected. They are habits of perception, not laws of nature. They can be unlearned. Psychologist Donald Winnicott spoke of transitional spaces, psychological territories between the known and unknown where transformation becomes possible. Creating these spaces in your life is essential. Find people who relate to you differently than your patterns expect. Environments that don't trigger your defensive adaptations. Activities that allow new aspects of yourself to emerge without judgment. When you enter relationships that break your habitual mold, expect resistance, not just from others, but from within. The unconscious perceives deviation from pattern as betrayal of identity. You may feel fraudulent, exposed, or strangely guilty when you stop participating in your familiar suffering. This discomfort signals not wrongness, but unfamiliarity, the growing pains of a self expanding beyond its wounds. Notice too how others respond when you step outside your patterns. Some will attempt to push you back into familiar roles. Some will feel threatened by your growth. Some will no longer recognize you. This is the hidden cost of transformation, the renegotiation of every relationship in your life. As you change, the system around you must either adapt or resist. Some connections strengthen, others dissolve. But there is also unexpected grace in this process. As you break free from compulsive repetition, you discover capacities long dormant within you. Playfulness where there was vigilance. Vulnerability where there was control. The parts of yourself sacrificed to adaptation begin to return, sometimes shyly, sometimes in overwhelming waves. You recover not just freedom from pain, but freedom to exist more fully. Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl reminded us that between stimulus and response lies a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Your patterns attempt to collapse this space, to create automatic reactions that bypass choice. Your work is to widen it, to create room for new possibilities between trigger and response. If this journey of breaking patterns resonates with you, know that you're not walking an easy path. You're attempting something profound, the rewriting of your most fundamental emotional programming. There will be days of crystal clarity when you see your patterns with perfect vision, and days when you find yourself deep within old reactions before you've even noticed the trigger. Progress is not linear. Healing moves in spirals, revisiting old territories with new awareness. What matters is not perfection but direction, not speed but sustainability, not performance but presence. Remember that what you're healing was not created in days or weeks, but in years of formative experience. The unconscious patterns formed slowly, wordlessly, in the delicate soil of early life. They will not dissolve overnight, but with consistent attention, with compassionate witness, with brave action, they begin to loosen their grip. The compulsion to repeat weakens. New possibilities emerge. French philosopher Albert Camus wrote, "In the midst of winter, I found there was, within me, an invincible summer." This summer exists within you too, a core of vitality untouched by your patterns. It waits beneath the repetition, beneath the familiar suffering, beneath the roles you've played to survive. It is the authentic self that persists despite everything that has happened to you. You were not born repeating these patterns. You were born with openness, with curiosity, with natural resonance to what nourishes rather than depletes. This essential nature remains, however buried it may seem. The greatest liberation comes not from controlling your patterns, but from remembering who you were before they became necessary. From reclaiming the authenticity that preceded adaptation. This remembering feels like coming home to yourself. Like putting down a heavy load you've carried so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. Like breathing fully after years of shallow breath. The patterns that have caused you pain contain within them the seeds of your most profound healing. The very repetition that has exhausted you can become the doorway to your freedom. What you've been repeating is not your destiny. It is merely the echo of what once happened to you. And echoes, no matter how persistent, eventually fade when no longer reinforced by new sound. You can choose, today, to stop creating the conditions for your own familiar suffering, to step outside the loop, to allow new experiences to write new neural pathways, new emotional possibilities. This choice must be made again and again, in large moments and small. In who you love, in how you speak to yourself, in what you believe you deserve, in where you direct your attention. The freedom you seek exists not in the absence of your patterns, but in your relationship to them, in your capacity to witness without attachment, to feel without following, to know without becoming. In breaking the loop, you do not erase your history. You simply prevent it from determining your future. You honor what happened by refusing to let it happen again in any disguise. And in this refusal, this gentle, persistent turning toward what heals rather than what merely feels familiar, you discover that the power was always yours. The pen that writes your story has always rested in your hand.